Hey everybody, this is a piece by Oskar Negt. It's from an issue or volume of Telos from 1975 to 1976. So I'm supposing that's winter 1975, 76. This issue, I'll probably read more of these in the future, but this issue has uh, a lot of, it's like a symposium kind of on Karl Korsch. There's a lot of essays on Karl Korsch in it. And I've never read anything by Oskar Negt. When I always wanted to. And I want to know more about Karl Korsch. And I felt like seeing this, it jumped out to me. So here we go. Theory, Empiricism, and Class Struggle on the Problem of Constitution in Karl Korsch by Oskar Negt. Footnote. The basic ideas of the present essay were presented in an article in the journal Politikon, October-November 1971. Critical objections, especially by Michael Buckmiller, who's like one of the big Korsch scholars in Germany. In the article Bemerkungen zu Oskar Negts Korsch-Kritik in Politikon, January-February 1972, and by Erich Gerlach, have led me to once again work through the available studies by Korsch. This showed that some of the criticisms were justified. This article appeared in the present form in Claudio Pazzoli's edited volume Über Karl Korsch, translated by Ray Morrow, End footnote. Quote, ... No party in any country can force me into silence when I have decided to speak, but I should still like to argue that you might do better to be somewhat less sensitive and in your action less Prussian. You, the Socialist Party, need socialist science, and socialist science cannot live without freedom of movement. A light strain, to say nothing of a rift, between the German Party and the German socialist science would thus be a misfortune and disgrace without precedent. That the executive committee and you personally retain and must retain a significant moral influence upon Neue Zeit and everything appearing elsewhere is self-understood. But that must suffice for you, and it can. And then again, you should not forget that the discipline in a great party can by no means be as strict as in a small sect. End quote. And that quote was from a letter by Engels to Babel, May 1st, 1891. End footnote. First section, the relevance of Korsch's thought. Today, within the framework of the newly posed task of a revolutionary restoration of Marxism, it becomes increasingly urgent to find solutions to problems directly relating to three main areas. The establishment of a materialist social research, without which Marxist theory threatens to lose its empirical substance, which is necessitated by the given experience organized by the division of labor in the particular sciences. The reformulation of the concept of objective truth, as found in a rudimentary but formally undeveloped form in the theses on Feuerbach. And finally, within the context of late capitalism, the specified determination of revolutionary, transforming and historical praxis as the essence of the dialectic between forces and relations of production, as well as between production and class struggle, which materializes in the structure of the social objects and needs. Within academic philosophy, all these issues are dealt with under the heading of the problem of, quote, Constitutionsfrage, or Constitutionsfrage, which, along with modern epistemology, traces back to Kant. In late capitalism, has only been taken up in Husserl's phenomenology, limited, however, to the set of problems on the relation between the social Lebenswelt, I think that's life world, and the sciences, and the methodological, F. Kaufmann, etc., and various related praxis philosophical approaches. For instance, the authors writing in Praxis, Karl Korsch, etc. The academic associations which accompany the concept of, quote, constitution, have apparently hindered its penetration into Marxist discussions. Even Karl Korsch does not explicitly deal with the question of constitution, although it is the basis of Korsch's critique of reflection and copy theory, which is Lenin's theory of knowledge. Likewise, it can be argued that ultimately all the epistemological difficulties of Korsch's theory rest upon this question. Korsch refers to the problem of constitution in three typical contexts: revolutionary praxis as socialization, the education of the proletariat as a class, and labor law. Korsch refers to the problem of constitution in three typical contexts: revolutionary praxis as socialization, the education of the proletariat as a class, and labor law. If man, as Marx puts it, quote, must prove the truth, that is, actuality and power, this sidedness of his thought in praxis, end quote, then this concept of truth is tested only when the proletarian class actively sets about transforming reality. For Korsch, this is only possible when there emerges an identity of objective knowledge and practical, humanly sensual activity immersed in historical perspectives, as found, for example, in socialization. In other words, the truth in this sidedness of human thought is confirmed only in the praxis of class struggle. The syndicalist forms of struggle have a central meaning in the constitution of the proletariat as a class. The process of transformation from the objective class situation to conscious, organized class politics is mediated through these forms of struggle. Where Korsch speaks explicitly of constitution in the sense of total social order, e.g. in Korsch's 1922 work on industrial law for factory councils, Arbeitsrecht für Betriebsräte, Korsch has in mind the constitutional legal concept. To be sure, during the period of the revolutionary bourgeoisie, it is difficult to separate this from the epistemological conception. Footnote. For example, for Kant, the treatment of the constitution problem is by no means an abstract scholastic philosophical exercise. He clearly perceives the relationship between the foundations of objective truth and social reality. The establishment of the conditions of constitution of objective reality and reality-related thinking. Hence the discovery of that, quote, hidden construction, of which Marx speaks, should contribute not only to the order of knowable things, but also to the overcoming of the Hobbesian state of social nature. Precisely in these social categories, Kant discusses the function of a critique of pure reason, quote, that metaphysics as the full and complete development of human reason, as mere speculation, it serves rather to prevent errors than to extend knowledge, does not detract from its value. On the contrary, this gives it dignity and authority through that censorship which secures general order and harmony, and indeed the well-being of the scientific commonwealth, preventing those who labor courageously and fruitfully on its behalf from losing sight of the supreme end, the happiness of all mankind, end quote. Kant, Critique of Pure Reason. End footnote. Korsch traces a parallel development between the state constitutionalism and the constitutionalism of industrial democracy, determined by the displacement of historical phases. If, in the development of the political community, constitutionalism marks only a transitional phase between absolute monarchy and full bourgeois democracy, then in the transitional phase to socialism, the, quote, development of the constitution of the community of labor, end quote, industrial constitutionalism is the beginning stage of industrial democracy. The constitution of legal reality is no longer homogeneous. The constitution of legal reality is no longer homogeneous, as was still the case in the subjective rights and objective legal institutions of the 19th century, which were exclusively formed through private property and bourgeois class domination. Rather, it is broken up into two-class subjects whose struggle is not only reflected in legal consciousness, but in institutions as well. Korsch, however, never again took up these important thoughts, nor did Korsch relate these thoughts to objective reality as a whole, independent of these thoughts merely a legal framework. If in the following investigation of Korsch's thought the problematic of constitution is central, that does not imply that it is an abstract philosophical critique. That would be inappropriate for the subject matter, for one can say without exaggeration that, from the problems of state organization to the theory of knowledge and the dialectic, for Korsch there is no theoretical questioning independently of the historical situation or isolated from the actual situation of the real class confrontation. The problem of the reflexive self-application of historical materialism also generates the attempts to periodize Marxist theory, which, according to Korsch, was never entirely in accord with the corresponding praxis of class struggle, not only in later developments, but from the very beginning. Thus, to analyze the driving contradictions of Korsch's thought in the context of theory, empiricism, and class struggle, a detailed discussion of Korsch's substantive interpretation of the historical constellations of the labor movement is required. What then is the relevance of Korsch's theory? In a social climate in which sections of the revolutionary intelligentsia and class-conscious unionized labor especially have recently gained a political interest in the critical appropriation of Korsch's theory, three factors are decisive. 1. Toward the end of the period of economic reconstruction in the early 1960s, class struggles in Western European countries not only intensified, but also changed their form. To be sure, traditional mass organizations, communist as well as social democratic and unionist, generally retain the loyalty of the masses represented by them. There have been no notable cleavages or splits, but at the same time primarily set off by the initiatives of students and youth revolts, radical movements have come into being within these organizations, as well as in extra-parliamentary spheres which are still difficult for the party and organizational apparatus to control. These spontaneous anti-bureaucratic movements express the masses' new political needs and interests which frequently go beyond immediate wage demands. Despite the difference in content, these demands all point in the same direction. The producer's self-organization and self-administration, a renewed vitalization of the practical experiences and ideas of the working class engaged in struggle, which, under specific historical conditions, are always related to the Revolutionary Commune of 1871, the Soviets, the German Council System of 1918, the Spanish Communes, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, etc. I'm going to repeat that whole sentence, it's all in italics. Despite the differences in content, these demands all point in the same direction. The producer's self-organization and self-administration, a renewed revitalization of the practical experiences and ideas of the working class engaged in struggle which, under specific historical conditions, are always related to the Revolutionary Commune of 1871, the Soviets, the German Council System of 1918, the Spanish Communes, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, etc. I would be very, very cautious of including the Chinese Cultural Revolution in this list. Check out the pieces that I have on the channel by Simon Lays, and also I think it's called The Chairman's New Clothes. But he wrote a book that was published by the same radical publisher that published situationist stuff, and I think like the collected works of George Orwell, and basically libertarian left stuff in France. And he basically says that the Chinese Cultural Revolution was kind of like an effort by one section of the bureaucracy to overthrow the other section of the bureaucracy after Mao was basically kicked upstairs, after the horrendous failure of the Great Leap Forward, which he insisted on, to my understanding, against the advice of many more cautious people within in the technical bureaucracy. But yeah, also check out the work by Lauren Goldner and other people. There's other critiques of Maoism and critiques of the Chinese Cultural Revolution's stated purpose. Anyway, That these organizational forms cannot be simply transposed to the current situation does not alter the fact that every step of real proletarian activity in capitalist countries and in the transformed socialist societies produces organizational forms which owe their validity and effectiveness to their historical circumstances. 2. Clearly, the de-Stalinization which began in the middle 1950s has scarcely helped to create a climate of discussion in which a Marxism, transformed into a science of legitimation by the Stalinist bureaucracy, could be overcome, and the revolutionary dialectical content of Marxian theory restored. The thrust of the rebelling students and youth of the protest movement was directed against this type of Marxism, which consisted of a number of ontologically reified laws, meant as control mechanisms rather than guidelines for action. They recognized that they could do nothing with such ready-made laws in their practical work. For that reason, they fell back on revolutionary conceptions which had proved effective for entirely different types of social conditions. The imaginative modes of action of the social revolutions of Cuba, Vietnam, and China. Since it quickly became apparent that the failure of the protest movement was ultimately grounded in this atheoretical behavior, it became necessary to recover the original contents of Marxian theory which had been encrusted by institutional instrumentalization. Most of all, it became necessary to resolve the modest problem of a reconstruction of the critique of political economy without falling into those forms of political dogmatism which play a fatal role from Kautsky to Stalinism. Substantial segments of the revolutionary intelligentsia have concluded from this that only the liquefaction of all of political economic categories and the vitalization of Marxian social theory can make a practical contribution by productively setting free the revolutionary contents of the dialectic of theory and praxis for the class struggle taking place before our eyes. And a lot of that sentence is in italics, so I'm going to reread it. Substantial segments of the revolutionary intelligentsia have concluded from this that only the liquefaction of political economic categories and the vitalization of Marxian social theory can make a practical contribution by productively setting free the revolutionary contents of the dialectic of theory and praxis for the class struggle taking place before our eyes. This is not to be separated from the reappropriation of the theoretical approaches of the more advanced Marxism suppressed and outlawed by the official Communist Party history. 3. Despite differences in organizational praxis, nearly all segments of the West German left seek to investigate the history of the labor movement from new viewpoints and bring to the attention of proletarian public opinion those currents within the labor movement which were accused of deviation and were gradually forgotten, although in their time they were very important for class confrontations and for the clarification of theoretical positions within Marxism. That the linear theory of progress of communist parties dominated by Soviet interest is not identical with the history of the revolutionary labor movement gradually becomes clear, even where excluded and in part physically liquidated, oppositional groups have not yet been rehabilitated by individual West European communist parties. Of course, all three levels are only symptoms of a political climate, and it would be false to de-emphasize the numerous new forms of dogmatism in theory and organization. What is new is that these dogmatic, theoretical, and organizational approaches today face continuous pressures of legitimation, not only from the side of critical and undogmatic Marxism, but mainly through the practical experience of class struggles. The theory of Karl Korsch, which over half a century ago reflected with supreme conceptual energy upon class struggles of the European labor movement, war, collapse, fascism, crises of labor organizations, is of particular relevance today for two main reasons. Earlier than most other Marxist theoreticians, Korsch recognized the political meaning of the relations between epistemological questions of Marxism and the immediate praxis of class conflict. Footnote. In an article in the Sozialistische Politik of February 1973, there appears an unusual explanation for the Korsch Renaissance. According to the author, Richard Albrecht, It is the interest of commercial capital which has brought Korsch into the market in order to deceive gullible intellectuals, quote, a typically imperialist maneuver in the ideological philosophical domain of class struggle, for which the works of Karl Korsch are excellently suited at the moment, end quote. Richard Albrecht. This article by a stupid author who puffs himself up as a Marxist and who can hardly camouflage with militant behavior his ignorance of what he sadly expounds, is completely irrelevant for an understanding of Korsch. It is worth reading on entirely different grounds. It shows how a previously significant socialist journal goes to the dogs when it gives up the spirit of Marxist critique. End footnote. Thus, Korsch initiated a phase of philosophical and political interpretation of Marx behind which a Marxist theory formation, which carries the categories of the critique of political economy into the stream of its historical movement, can fall back only when abandoning the materialist knowledge interest. Since Korsch's program for a restoration of the revolutionary content of Marxist theory cannot be reduced to a more or less abstract philological reconstruction, separate from real class struggles, it is not surprising that the contradictions of the real movement, as well as the situation of Korsch's increasing isolation and opposition, and as an immigrant, is reflected in the theory itself. Thus, internal logical consistency is not the standard by which to measure Korsch's thought. On the other hand, Korsch had raised anew the organization question at every stage of development as a substantive problem of workers' self-determination over the workers' work and life processes. With unparalleled persistence, Korsch held fast to the idea of self-administration, the councils as the basic corporate unit, as, quote, forms of counter-government, end quote, and as fundamentally the only legitimate political form of expression of the masses' self-organization and self-education. Korsch maintained this conviction in spite of the Leninist party organizations, which moved into the foreground of his political praxis. Just a side note from me, according to Douglas Kellner, who wrote like a pretty substantial piece on Korsch that's on this channel, Korsch didn't really come to like a councilist position, or even like a particularly critical Leninism until rather late. Like I think he was a pretty conventional Communist Party politician in the early 1920s, and didn't really come to council communist positions proper until a little bit later, towards the late 1920s. Or at least that's how I remember the essay. Anyway, Korsch maintained this conviction in spite of the Leninist party organizations which moved into the foreground of Korsch's political praxis. After the failure of the council system in Germany and Hungary, party organizations became for Korsch the, quote, visible content of the thought corresponding to the class situation, end quote. Korsch, Lenin und Comintern. That might be on this channel, I'm not sure. Lenin and the Comintern. Wherever the council's organizational form emerges historically, whether in the form of the Paris Commune, which was primarily distinguished for Marx by its content as a, quote, laboring corporate body, end quote, Arbeitende Körperschaft, whether as Soviets, the council organs in Germany, or the anarcho-syndicalist communal constitutions of the Spanish Republic, Korsch analyzes them all from the perspective of the expressive richness of mass spontaneity, the creative diversity of the forms of emancipation which no centralized organization or cadre party is in a position to construct or plan in advance. Footnote: Bertolt Brecht, who throughout his life had acknowledged Korsch without reservation as the authority in all questions of Marxism, clearly expresses in a letter to Korsch dated January 19th, 1941, the central problem of the question of organization as posed for Marxists. Quote, I would expect a lot from a historical investigation of the relation between councils and parties. The specific causes for the failure of the councils, the historical grounds would be of great interest to me. That is tremendously important for us. And aside from yourself, I would know of no one who could investigate that, end quote. Bertolt Brecht. Unfortunately, Korsch never systematically investigated this relation of burning actuality today between councils and political forms of organization. End footnote. Thus, unlike Lukács, who was much readier to compromise and who was always afraid of losing his internal party audience, Korsch never derived historical fetishized models valid for all phases of proletarian class struggle from organizational forms of the working class which had arisen and had been preserved in specific historical situations. Korsch applied to parties, as well as to councils, revolutionary communes, and trade unions, the Marxian idea that, quote, at a certain point in its development, every historical form was dialectically transformed from a form developing revolutionary productive forces, action, and consciousness into a fetter of the same. End quote. Korsch. A revolutionary commune. That, I believe, is definitely... I'm pretty sure that's on this channel. Both levels of argumentation of Korsch's thought have had a great influence on the revolutionary intelligentsia during the past decade, especially in Germany, where the revolutionary intelligentsia did not have first-hand knowledge of the living traditions of the labor movement. That is not accidental. At least since his 1929 Anti-Critique, through the permanent conceptual effort to reestablish the revolutionary content of Marxist social theory, and through the self-application of historical materialism, Korsch tried to theoretically update the experience of a historical situation which is still relevant for the labor movement today. The degeneration of revolutionary Marxism to a science of legitimation. This degeneration began with the policy of, quote, socialism in one country, was institutionally consolidated with the unfolding of Stalinism, was enforced through the threat of death for deviations, and had as its central epistemological instrument the reflection or copy theory. The disappearance of the revolutionary drive of the European labor movement and the accompanying menacing growth of counter-revolutionary currents had led Korsch to focus on praxis in his critique of epistemological objectivism, already formulated in Marxism and Philosophy 1923, and to reveal the catastrophic practical objectivism contained in the economic theory of the crash and in the idea of the law-like historical inevitability of socialism. Korsch's undogmatic approach to Marxism did not seek to establish what Marx actually meant. Rather, it attempted to grasp the, quote, critical, pragmatic, and activist element, end quote, inseparable from Marxist social theory, and to employ it as a weapon in the proletarian class struggle. Thus, the practical question concerning the meaning of theory for class struggle penetrates even subtle epistemological discussions, which intensified significantly after the threatening failure of Western European approaches to revolution and the expansion of counter-revolutionary movements. Quote, there is no use in discussing controversial points in any social theory, unless such discussion is part of an existing social struggle. There must be several possibilities of action for the party, group, or class to which the social theory in question refers. End quote. Korsch, a non-dogmatic approach to Marxism. New section. The Marxian theory of revolution and the essence of the political. By applying the materialist conception of history to the development of Marxism and in determining the historical relationship between theory and praxis, Korsch found himself entangled in a contradiction towards whose clarification and resolution Korsch devoted a substantial part of his thought. On the one hand, Korsch unreservedly accepted the interpretation of theory found in the Communist Manifesto, according to which the communists, quote, theoretical conclusions, quote, merely express in general terms actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement going on under our very eyes, end quote. Communist Manifesto. Not accidentally, this is one of the most frequent citations from Marx and Korsch's writings. The reality content of Marxist theory's ability to guide political action, is correspondingly grounded in Marxist theory's concrete grasp, i.e., in a general form suitable for, quote, intellectual action, end quote. Geistige action. Of the actual situation and direction of class struggles. On the other hand, Korsch discovered throughout the history of Marxism glaringly illustrated during the Stalinist period, but in principle already in Marx and Engels and especially in Kautsky's orthodoxy, a structural contradiction between the real movement of a class conflict and theory. Quote, "It is an especially clear example of that striking contradiction which, in one form or other, is noticeable in all phases of the historical development of Marxism. It can be characterized as the contradiction between Marxist ideology on the one hand and the real historical movement always concealed by this ideological disguise on the other." End quote. Korsch, on the history of Marxist ideology in Russia. End footnote. Korsch, however, is not satisfied with criticizing these ideological distortions as mere deviations from an original Marxian theory assumed to be unchangeable and valid. Of course, for Korsch, there are also historical moments when the restoration of revolutionary Marxism has been achieved, as in the case of the active unfolding of the dialectic of theory and praxis in Lenin's State and Revolution. There are also exceptions as seen in Bernstein's reversal, in this, quote, "most conscientious, honorable, and consequential of all unsocialist socialists," end quote. Korsch, Sozialismus und soziale Reform. I guess that's socialism and reform. When Korsch destroyed there are also exceptions as seen in Bernstein's reversal. In this, quote, "most conscientious, honorable, and consequential of all unsocialist socialists," end quote. When Bernstein destroyed social democratic reformism's ideological veiling of reality by decisively turning away from Marxism. Of course, the revolutionary socialist Korsch, who was familiar with the theoryless pragmatic militancy of the English labor movement, indefatigably fought Bernstein's position. I think prior to World War I, I'm not exactly sure about this, but I think prior to World War I, when Korsch was becoming a socialist, I think he spent a decent amount of time in England and was influenced by English Fabianism in that period, at least. I'm not exactly sure. That might be incorrect. But at least Bernsteinian revisionism expressed a real historical state of affairs, the primarily state-guided unionist and political praxis of social democracy. Quote, in this sense, one can actually invert the generally accepted relationship between Kautsky quote, Marxism and Bernsteinian, quote, revisionism, and define Kautsky's orthodox Marxism as the theoretical obverse and symmetrical complement of Bernstein's revisionism, end quote. Korsch, Marxism and Philosophy. The situation to which Korsch reacted was determined by a confusing multiplicity of political positions: orthodoxy, revisionism, centralism, and ultra-leftism, all of which equally referred to Marx and Engels to legitimate their respective praxis. Bernstein himself, in his early essay on the presuppositions of socialism, or Voraussetzungen des Sozialismus, could not resist the pressure to search for legalistic evidence in Marx and Engels. Under these conditions, Korsch sought to establish that authentic form of Marxist theory from which to expect a binding force and practical effectiveness for revolutionary action. First, in 1918, Korsch's criticism was directed at one of the most important obstacles to a thoroughgoing socialist overthrow: Kautsky's orthodoxy, which had discarded all practical questions concerning the transition from capitalism to socialism and the problem of the revolutionary state. Then, following the failure of the West European Revolution, the instrumentalization of communist parties in the interests of the Soviet state after 1925, and Korsch's expulsion from the party, Korsch rapidly learned from bitter experience that it was not a matter of a particular problem with the Second International. Rather was a, quote, ideological, or weltanschauliche, solidarity of the entire international Marx orthodoxy, end quote. Korsch, which also included the Stalinist legacy of Lenin. Korsch had his first political experiences with the English Fabians. See, I know what I'm talking about. Look at that. Korsch had his first political experiences with the English Fabians. Their customary matter-of-fact approach shaped his way of thinking throughout his life. It enters in as one moment in Korsch's concept of praxis, which can neither be reduced to organizational technique nor completely separated from pragmatic and syndicalist elements. In this historically determinate and therefore changeable sense, praxis remains the reference point of Korsch's entire thought. In principle, even during that phase of his life when he completely cut himself off from active participation in class struggles. Thus, in 1920, Korsch identified socialization, the essence of practical humanly sensual activity, and of objective knowledge, with social revolution. Korsch spoke not as a distant philosophizing theoretician, but as a practical socialist alarmed by the lack of revolutionary imagination, the, quote, near incomprehensible backwardness of socialist theory confronted with all the problems of practical realization, end quote. Korsch, caused by the growth of Kautsky's Marxist orthodoxy and directionless reformism. Footnote, see Korsch, Grundsätzliches über Sozialisierung. End footnote. Thus, those who accuse Korsch of sharing assumptions of identity theory, as the Communist Party has done, deliberately ignore the weight that such statements have for Korsch. Korsch steadfastly adhered to the concept of fundamental democratic socialization, clearly demarcating it from the politics of simple state socialization. Similarly, after Korsch's activities as a party communist had run aground, it never occurred to Korsch to fetishize the council constitution out of disappointment. On the contrary, Korsch warned against denouncing the departure from these organizational forms as mere subjective treason by individuals. In 1929, Korsch wrote, quote, now, after the overcoming of the world economic crisis of the year 1921 and the thereby conditioned defeats of the German, Polish, Italian workers, and the following chain of further proletarian defeats to the English general strike and miners' strike of 1926, European capitalism has begun a new cycle of dictatorship on the back of the suppressed working classes. Under these changed objective conditions, we revolutionary proletarian fighters can no longer subjectively hold on, completely unexamined and unchanged, to our old beliefs in the revolutionary meaning of the council theory and the revolutionary character of council government as the direct further development of the political form of the proletarian dictatorship, quote, discovered by the Paris Communards half a century ago, end quote. Korsch, Revolutionary Commune. This confidence in council organizations, broken by the expansion of counter-revolutionary movements, reawakened as the leading labor organizations of Catalonia, the syndicalist CNT and the anarchist FAI, implemented a form of communal production never before tried on such a scale. The Spanish Revolution concluded the revolutionary wave following the First World War. Despite its failure for Korsch, there were two legacies of its experiential content. First of all, organizations which ideologically refused to participate in politics, as for example the tradition-rich Spanish syndicalists and anarchists, were forced by the pressure of bitter experiences to recognize in the proletarian class struggle, especially during its revolutionary phase, the permanent connection between economic and political action. Secondly, the Spanish Revolution time and again confirmed that the masses in their struggles create an impressive multiplicity of forms for a new type of transition from capitalist to communal modes of economic production. For Korsch, however, this descriptive analysis of concrete instances of class struggle must not be separated from the effort to simultaneously understand every practical question as a revival and active realization of Marx's social theory, along with Marx's materialist conception of history and the critique of political economy. The theoretician of, quote, historical specification, end quote, who continually emphasized the need to apply historical materialism to its own development, saw himself faced with the task of going back to the historical origins of Marxism in order to release Marxist theory from the ossified monolithic block of orthodoxy. Korsch tried to locate those historically developed tendencies which inevitably have worked their way into Marxist social theory and which constitute its inner structure of tension. 4, quote, In the final analysis, today's crisis is the crisis of Marx's and Engels' theory as well, the ideological and doctrinaire separation of, quote, pure theory from the real historical movement, as well as the further development of theory, is itself an expression of the present crisis, end quote. Korsch. Crisis of Marxism. In the context of the present argument, it is not particularly relevant to trace Korsch's attempt to periodize the history of Marxism. If Korsch speaks of reconstituting the revolutionary content of Marxism, Korsch, like Lenin, understands this not as an objective problem separate from the actual class struggle. Korsch describes Lenin, even after his own expulsion from the party, as the greatest revolutionary politician of the present epoch. In fact, Lenin's State and Revolution obviously represented the model of Korsch's own efforts to reconstitute Marxism. The, quote, problem of reconstitution should therefore be briefly discussed in terms of the following three practical questions, which are central for theory formation: the revolutionary commune, the theory of revolution, and the trade union question. The, quote, problem of reconstitution should therefore be briefly discussed in terms of the following three practical questions, which are central for theory formation: the revolutionary commune, the theory of revolution, and the trade union question. New section, on the Paris Commune. One second, sorry. New section, on the Paris Commune. If in the address to the General Council on the Civil War in France, Marx describes the Paris Commune of 1871 as a government of the working class, the result of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating class, and as the, quote, finally discovered political form under which the economic liberation of work can be completed, end quote. Korsch objects that the Commune is linked to the history of bourgeois emancipation precisely through this political form. Korsch objects that the Commune is linked to the history of bourgeois emancipation precisely through this political form. Thus, through almost 1,000 years of development, the Commune turned out to be not only a substantially older bourgeois form of government than Parliament, but is the purest class-like appearance. The purest class-like appearance of the struggle of the bourgeois class against the feudal social order up to the culmination of the revolutionary movement of the bourgeoisie in the Great French Revolution of 1789 to 1793. There is evidence that Marx himself was not aware of this connection. In fact, the Poverty of Philosophy of 1847 already contains the remark that the coalitions found in the medieval municipality have, for the constitution of the bourgeois class, a function similar to that of strikes and coalitions for the constitution of the working class. Quote, with respect to the bourgeoisie, we have to distinguish two phases: that in which the bourgeoisie constituted itself as a class under the regime of feudalism and absolute monarchy, and that in which, already constituted as a class, the bourgeoisie overthrew feudalism and monarchy to form a bourgeois society. The first of these phases was the longer and demanded the greater efforts. This too began by partial coalitions against the feudal lords. Much research has been carried out to trace the different historical phases that the bourgeoisie has passed through, from the Commune up to the Commune's constitution, from the Commune up to its constitution as a class. But when it is a question of making a precise study of strikes, coalitions, and other forms in which the proletarians accomplished their constitution, as a class right before our eyes, some are seized with real fear and others display a transcendental disdain, end quote. Marx, The Poverty of Philosophy. What Korsch criticizes is not what Marx describes as the great social measure of the Paris Commune, namely, its own working existence. What Korsch tries to point out is the contradiction between the historically adequate assessment of the Commune and the strategic judgment of its meaning for the working class. The address to the General Council, besides being an effort to describe the specific mode of functioning of a, quote, republic of labor, is also a factional polemic against Proudhonists and anarchists who not only controlled the majority in the commune, but were also the commune's most imaginative and active supporters. Thus, it is not accidental that Marx emphasized the proletarian class content of the commune as a working corporate body, and its negating function as the destruction of the bourgeois machinery of the state. At the same time, Marx left the political form of the communal constitution undetermined, e.g., whether it should be centralized or federalist. Quote, for the sake of the revolutionary essence of the Paris Commune, Marx suppressed the criticism of the particular form of its historical appearance, which he should have pursued given his theoretical perspective. End quote. Korsch, the Revolutionary Commune. Hence, he tries not only to incorporate Marxism into the commune, but the commune into Marxism at the same time. If Lenin repeatedly stressed that Marx was a centralist, Lenin was certainly correct. But Marx himself had pointed out the unambiguous federalist tendencies of the communal constitution within the framework of a centralism which did not correspond to the historical form of the Paris Commune. In his critical revival of Marxism, Korsch was not interested in questioning the epochal validity of Marxian social theory. On the contrary, since Korsch explored the political and social constellations which infiltrated it during the period of its genesis, he wanted to uncover the historical contents of those particular conceptions in this case. The revolutionary commune, which guard against an abstract development of Marxist theory isolated from real class struggles. The sublation of the reifications in the development of the Marxist theory begins with the liquefaction of the very teachings of Marx and Engels. The degeneration of Marxian theory into a science of legitimation stems precisely from the way in which its determining contradictory tendencies are harmonized in a global Weltanschauung. Detached from their critical revolutionary contents, these contradictory tendencies can be subordinated to any political interest whatsoever. New section, on the concept of revolution. To the end of his life, Korsch held that the Marxian conception of the political is characterized by Jacobin and Blancist tendencies. The separation of politics and interest, a proletarian self-organization and party, the related over-evaluation of the political, and finally, as a historical example, the self-liquidation of the councils in Russia, I wouldn't say they were self-liquidated, in favor of a centralized political apparatus of domination, so far removed from proletarian interest that even the European counter-revolution could use them. All of this indicates to Korsch that already in Marx, the theory of revolution is internally split. All of this indicates to Korsch that already in Marx, the theory of revolution is internally split. Quote, in many respects, the proletarian revolution still carries the birthmarks of the bourgeois revolutionary theory of Jacobinism and Blanchism. Footnote. See Korsch, State and Counter-Revolution, which I believe is on this channel. End footnote. The kernel of Korsch's critique of the Marxian theory of revolution lies in the overestimation of the political element of action stemming from the bourgeois concept of revolution. The bourgeois elements Marx transferred to the proletarian revolutionary theory of, quote, historically and theoretically, only the character of a transition. What is thus created is a theory of proletarian revolution, not as it has developed on its own roots, but on the contrary, as it emerges from the bourgeois revolution, ... End quote. Korsch. According to Korsch, this Jacobinism in the Marxian theory of revolution is what ultimately leads Marx to develop his theory of classes in political terms. According to Korsch, this Jacobinism in the Marxian theory of revolution is what ultimately leads Marx to develop his theory of classes in political terms. As a result, he implicitly subordinates the manifold activities of the masses in their everyday class struggles to those activities exerted by political leaders and the vanguards in the interests of the masses. To support this thesis, Korsch refers to an 1885 letter from Engels to Versailles. In trying to grasp the political direction of the explosive Russian situation, Engels significantly argues by analogy to the French Revolution. Once in Russia, quote, 1789 has been launched, and 1793 will not be long in following, end quote. Engels says, quote, "What I know or believe I know about the situation in Russia makes me think that the Russians are approaching their 1789. The revolution must break out there within a short period of time. The revolution may break out any day. In these circumstances, the country is like a charged mine which only needs a match to be applied to it. ... This is one of the exceptional cases where it is possible for a handful of people to make a revolution, i.e. with one little push to cause a whole system, which ... is in more than labile equilibrium, to come crashing down, and thus by an action in itself insignificant, to release explosive forces that afterwards become uncontrollable. Well now, if ever Blanchism, the fantastic idea of overturning an entire society by the action of a small conspiracy, had a certain raison d'etre, that is certainly the case now in Petersburg. Once the spark has been put to the powder, once the forces have been released, and national energy has been transformed from potential into kinetic, ... the people who laid the spark to the mine will be swept away by the explosion, which will be 1,000 times as strong as they themselves, and which will seek its vent where it can, as the economic forces and resistance determine." End quote. This conception of revolutionary processes, cited in the passage from Engels' letter, appears to be completely and exclusively end quote. Did I say end quote? End quote. Footnote. See Marx and Engels Selected Correspondence, page 384, in the edition published Moscow, 1965. End footnote. This conception of revolutionary processes, cited in the passage from Engels' letter, appears to be completely and exclusively grounded on the, quote, substitutionalist, end quote, behavior of active and resolute minorities. It clearly contradicted the Korschian conception of the mass self-organization. It is questionable, however, whether it characterized the Marxian conception of revolution as a whole. Korsch sought to clarify the previously mentioned internal disunity within the Marxian conception of revolution through the concept of material productive forces. Korsch argues that the, quote, two phases of the Marxian revolutionary theory, end quote, before and after the critical year 1850, indicated not only formal, but also systematic differences. The disunity lies in the fact that the revolution derives one time entirely from the objective development of material productive forces, at another time and likewise with the same definiteness as human activity. The social revolution of the proletariat is an action of men united in a definite social class and engaged in a war against other social classes, with all the chances and all the risks attached to such a real practical effort. End quote. Footnote. Full quote found in Karl Korsch, Karl Marx. Partial translation published in 1967. Partial translation found in Karl Korsch, Karl Marx, English translation. End footnote. In any case, unlike the anarchists, Korsch himself insisted on the political character of class struggles, even if Korsch's proletarian concept of the political is always shaped by infrastructural activity. That is clearly expressed in Korsch's attitude towards the syndicalist forms of struggle and the role of trade unions. On the trade union question. New section, on the trade union question. Korsch repeatedly dealt with trade union problems during the different phases of his political development. When in Korsch's article, The Restoration of Marxism and the So-Called Trade Union Question, Korsch called for trade unions to consider not just factional and purely organizational aspects, but also to proceed from the political essence of union struggles. Korsch again wanted to emphasize Marx's thoughts in the poverty of philosophy. The economic struggles of the working class are not solely aimed at the improvement of its social position, but more importantly towards the formation of the proletariat as a class. In this context, Marx speaks of the analysis which must be given to strikes, coalitions, and other forms, whereby the proletariat develops its organization into a class before our own eyes. Korsch is also concerned precisely with these other forms of class confrontations, which cover the entire breadth of intrastructural action. For example, the struggle of the unorganized, the jobless, the independent industrial councils, the shop stewards movement, wildcat strikes, etc. When Korsch argues that the trade union struggle is both the unconditionally necessary presupposition of workers' collective action and the economic form of appearance of the revolutionary class struggle. Furthermore, questions such as the relationship between unions and parties, economic interest in politics, as well as the historical imitations of these organizational forms, can be adequately dealt with only from the standpoint of the constitution of the proletarian class. This consists in the peculiar dialectic of such organizations, their changing from forms of development into fetters of the class struggle, in the underbrush of different political factions, whose relationship to trade union organizations is considerably more complex than to party organizations. Korsch also attempted to penetrate the main themes of Marx's work to the central standpoint from which the relevant questions can be treated. Since Korsch speaks of the process of the constitution of the proletariat into a class, Korsch assumes that the established unity of political and economic struggles can lead to proletarian revolution. In The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx had already described this in the apparently contradictory determinations of this process of constitution. On the one hand, the proletarian struggle against the bourgeoisie begins with the proletariat's existence, therefore with the economic fact of exploitation. On the other, however, every class struggle is political. Although Korsch agrees with Marx's claim in Wages, Price, and Profit that, quote, trade unions are necessary as rallying points of resistance against the forces of capital, end quote, Korsch sees this only as one side of proletarian class politics. Quote, these worker struggles against the economic power of capital led by labor unions, or under some circumstances, without or against them, are therefore in their essential class nature as political as those against the political power of capital, the bourgeois state, led by the so-called workers' parties, and likewise under some circumstances without or against them. The fusion of both forms of struggle into the completely developed unitary economic, political, and revolutionary proletarian class struggle seeking to annihilate the economic and political bourgeois organization of power and to erect in its place the state and the economic power of the revolutionary working class. The revolutionary class dictatorship of the proletariat will finally reach the goal sought by the isolated, quote, economic and, quote, political partial struggles of the preceding period, which in their external manifestations appeared to pursue other goals, the constitution of the proletariat as a class. The constitution of the proletariat as a class, end quote. Korsch. The restoration of Marxism in the so-called trade union question. New section. Theory and Constitution. On the basis of this emphatic understanding of praxis, and within the context of a rigorously followed dialectic of theory and praxis, Korsch is unwaveringly concerned with deriving criteria of verification and falsification for individual propositions of Marxian social theory from the historically specific development of praxis as a form of the real class struggle. If the dialectical development of praxis as a form of the real if the dialectical relationship of theory and praxis turns into a simple contradictory relationship, then theory loses theory's living force and becomes a lifeless system of presuppositions on the same level as bourgeois science. In the so-called Zurich Theses of 1950, the, quote, reconstruction of a revolutionary theory and praxis, unquote, presupposes immediately, quote, breaking with Marxism's monopolistic claim to revolutionary initiative and to theoretical and practical leadership, unquote. Korsch. Nevertheless, it would be false to attribute to Korsch inclinations towards empiricism from the beginning, as expressed, for example, in his cooperation with Kurt Lewin, and assert that in later years he completely discarded Marxism. Wikipedia says Kurt Lewin lived from 1890 to 1947 and was a German-American psychologist known as one of the modern pioneers of social organization and applied psychology in the United States. During his professional career, Kurt Lewin's academic research and writings focused on applied research, action research, and group communication. Lewin is often recognized as the, quote, founder of social psychology, end quote, and was one of the first to study group dynamics and organizational development. A review of General Psychology survey published in 2002 ranked Kurt Lewin as the 18th most cited psychologist of the 20th century. During Kurt Lewin's career, Kurt Lewin was affiliated with several U.S. and European universities, including the University of Berlin, Cornell University, MIT, Stanford University, and the University of Iowa. Back to the text. Rather, the development of Korsch's theory exhibits an immanent logic which, according to its own claims, not only describes and explains individual appearances, but as a, quote, theory of social revolution embracing all domains of social life as a totality, end quote, wants to grasp the essence of the capitalist social order and determine its transcending forces. In 1938, Korsch clearly formulated his interpretation of Marxism. In its theoretical form and its main tendency, it would be, quote, above all, a strictly empirical investigation and critique of society, so in its content it is above all economic research, end quote. Korsch. Korsch dealt with a multitude of empirical problems, with union wage demands, labor law, the fascist state, political problems such as the Dawes Plan, historical situations such as the Spanish Revolution and Stalinism. Striking in this list is not only the lack of political economic analyses of the capitalist production process and of class structure, apart from smaller, matter-of-fact, insignificant works, such as for example, the Varga Reviews, the article Das Problem der Goldinflation in den Vereinigten Staaten, and the article Die Theorie der Grundrente by Varga and Marx, und Marx. But also the mistakable tendency to assume the actual practice of class struggle as the final reference point for all of these analyses. Korsch evidently assumes that propositions concerning the economic basis possess an unchanged and unchangeable validity affecting the entire capitalist social formation. Quote, the critique of political economy as embodied in capital deals with the state and the law, and with such, quote, higher, i.e. still more ideological social phenomena as philosophy, art, and religion, only in occasional remarks which light up, in sudden flashes, extensive fields of social activity, yet it remains a materialistic investigation into the whole of existing bourgeois society. Yet capital remains a materialistic investigation into the whole of existing bourgeois society. It proceeds methodologically from the view that when we have examined the bourgeois mode of production and the bourgeois mode of production's historical changes, we have thereby examined everything of the structure and development of the present-day society, which can be the subject matter of a strictly empirical science. In this sense, Marx's materialistic social science is not sociology, but economics, end quote. Korsch. And again, that's from Karl Korsch's book, Karl Marx. As a result, economic concepts are objectively valid forms of thought for the entire mode of production. For example, capitalism, whose validity cannot be negated through theoretical sublation, but only through the revolutionary overturning of the existing state of affairs. But if there are these differences in the realm of validity of propositions, then, for Korsch, the further development of the critique of political economy is superfluous. By simply presupposing the economic analysis of capitalism, Korsch found the interesting levels of investigation which indicate the historically variable constellations of social forces underneath this orthodoxy of economic critique. What is lacking are the mediating links between the inner and general law of movement of capital and the concrete historical development process of capitalism. Footnote. See especially the fundamental critique of Ernest Mandel, Der Spätkapitalismus. And footnote. I don't know who's the author of that is, though. Is that him? I don't know. Of Oskar Negt. Anyway, thus the only criterion of validity for revolutionary revival of Marxian theory is the praxis of class struggle, the historical movement of emancipation taking place before our own eyes. If, however, the criterion of praxis serves as the foundation of the theory of knowledge, then from the very beginning it appears in Korsch's work in a peculiar, contracted way. Praxis as capitalist production, for example, is not really ignored. Praxis as capitalist production remains invariant until the moment of the revolutionary transformation, experiencing no changes arising from the concrete social totality which would determine consciousness and action. This perceptible task of theoretical sense for the, quote, differences of form, end quote, of economic relations has far-reaching consequences. Korsch directed all the energy of his philosophical critique toward a refutation of the copy of reflection theory. In Marxism and Philosophy, a work which sought to achieve the philosophical dialectical restoration along the lines followed by Lenin in dealing with the theory of the state, this is still done with the expectation that it could be made understandable as a mere misunderstanding of Marxian theory. And then, with the extreme critical sharpness and practical toughness, in 1929, Korsch followed with the, quote, anti-critique, because he had not counted on such a massive rebuffing of his arguments, especially from the Communist Party. In terms of form, of course, there is substantial difference between Marxism and Philosophy, the book, and the, quote, anti-critique of 6 years later. Yet the content is the same, with one exception: the Leninism stamped by Stalinism explicitly drawn into the 1929 critique. Korsch's viewpoint can be summarized as follows. 1. Social existence, Sein, and the forms of consciousness produced by social existence cannot be separated from one another unless one wants to fall back to the level of pre-dialectical naive realism. Rather, social existence and the forms of consciousness produced by social existence are components of the material reality constituted as totality. Yet in the realm of the ideological superstructure, the economic forms of thought assume a special place as objective, valid categories in a society in which capitalist commodity production predominates. Two, the main danger for revolutionary Marxist theory is not idealism, as Lenin and his philosophical apologists suggest, but the undialectical materialism. The undialectical materialism that Korsch recognized very early is not yet fully materialist, emergent variants of positivism, pragmatism, or scientific vulgar materialism, what is today the predominant ideology of the bourgeois class. 3. Leninism designates specific elements of the experience of the Russian labor movement, which could also provide the theoretical foundation for the European labor movement. Undoubtedly, Korsch in the anti-critique wanted to confront the Leninist theory of reflection, What he actually confronted, however, was the philosophers and party theoreticians of pre-Stalinism. By that time, the propositions of Lenin's materialism and empiricism already had the coloring of bureaucratic legitimation. This interpretation of Leninist conceptions already indicates the difficulties of a conception of theory reduced to the praxis of class struggle, which underhandedly assumes ahistorical tendencies. It is impossible to separate the 1908 situation in which Lenin wrote Materialism and Empirical criticism from the theses of the book, which were meant to express unambiguous demarcations, always exhibiting a polemical and militant thrust. In an environment in which idealism is widespread among large groups of the intelligentsia, Fideism and religious consciousness are popular among the masses, etc., the materialist side of Marxian theory, natural scientific thought, indeed the materialism of 18th century Enlightenment philosophy, must be emphasized because of the practical needs of a determinate historical situation, and not from the perspective of a textually correct interpretation of Marxian theory. This is the only way that Lenin's naive epistemological perspective can be explained today and to a certain extent justified. Quote, if objective truth exists, as the materialists think, if natural science, reflecting the outer world in human, quote, experience, is alone capable of giving us objective truth, then all Fideism is absolutely refuted, end quote. Lenin. Of course, Lenin himself attempted to refer back to Marx and Engels in order to substantiate conceptions originating from a specific historical situation and deriving their moment of truth through the sociological and political function. Since, for example, Lenin polemicized against idealistic forms of the identity of thought and being and correctly emphasized their non-identity, i.e. the impossibility in principle of sublating the object known into the knowing subject. Lenin also introduced the reflection thesis as a secure and central teaching of Marxian theory. Quote, social consciousness reflects social being, that is Marx's teaching. A reflection may be an approximate true copy of the reflected, but to speak of identity is absurd, end quote. Lenin, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. Yet Lenin neither dreamed of canonizing his writings concerning, quote, militant materialism, nor of allowing his struggle against idealism to become an easily avoidable pretext for censoring thought. For example, in the controversy with Bogdanov, Lenin not only refused to solve philosophical problems through parliamentary decisions or expulsions, but while working on imperial criticism, Lenin frankly admitted his incompetence in questions of philosophy. Quote, I do not hold myself sufficiently competent in these subjects to hurry to appear in print, but I always carefully followed our party debates on philosophy, ... End quote. Letter to A.M. Gorky, February 25, 1908, in Letters to Lenin, translated and edited by Elizabeth Hill and Doris Muddy, published in 1937. End footnote. Even in the pre-Stalinist period, when the, quote, Menshevik-tending idealism, end quote, of Deburin, along with the, quote, mechanical materialism, end quote, of Bukharin, were toppled by the party's verdict on them, the reflection theory had already been reified as a pragmatic instrument of party politics. The, quote, natural laws of society, which according to Marx are to be sublated in critical revolutionary praxis so that men can make their history with will and consciousness, become mere specifications of the basic laws of a dialectic of nature. They retain the validity of real natural laws which copy and reflect the world but cannot be overcome through theory and praxis. Even when Korsch, unlike the Lukács of history and class consciousness, adhered to the dialectic of nature, Korsch still saw through the objectivist tendency of Marxist thought, which resulted in the destruction of the revolutionary dialectic. Quote, Marx and Engels were dialecticians before they were materialists, end quote. This proposition was meant temporarily as well as systematically. The corruption of the revolutionary dialectic is theoretically prepared by the faith in progress, ostensibly resting on social natural laws. The hollow pathos which makes victories of defeats, e.g., quote, we follow Hitler, end quote. Nach Hitler kommen wir. If you don't know, it means it was popular in the Communist Party was quickly repressed after the Nazis came to power, but there was this idea that, like, after the Nazis, us. So that's what we follow Hitler means. It's not like we agree with Hitler, but like we'll be next. So 1933 marked a world historical defeat, I think, for the working class and humanity as well. And I think that that's what is being referred to here is like this kind of like optimism in these and turning these catastrophic defeats into victories. Quote, since Lenin and Lenin's followers unilaterally transfer the dialectic in object, nature, and history, and they present knowledge merely as a passive mirror and reflection of this objective being in the subjective consciousness. In doing so, Lenin and his followers destroy both the dialectical interrelation between being and consciousness, and as a necessary consequence, the dialectical interrelation between theory and practice, end quote. Korsch. Marxism and philosophy. As already indicated, Korsch's sensitivity to deformations of Marxian theory led Korsch to persist with the program of unflaggingly applying historical materialism to historical materialism's own history, and to quote, restoring the dialectical revolutionary substance of Marxian theory as the most solid criterion of its empirical content. This insistence on the unfalsified and unabridged doctrine, which carries Korsch's approach to knowledge, also constitutes the historical limitations of Korsch's thought. In fact, Korsch cannot really push further his thoroughly convincing critique of the Leninist and especially the Stalinist conceptions, since the most important question in this context, namely the constitution of objects and the objectivity of experience, the constitution of objects and the objectivity of experience, mediated by historical praxis, was not formally developed by Marx and therefore cannot be simply assimilated. This question brings together all the difficulties of Korsch's thought. In History and Class Consciousness, young Lukács tried to grasp history as an uninterrupted process, overturning the forms of objectivity which determine human existence, intellection, and perception. Phenomenological theoreticians ground organized scientific experience on the, quote, foundation of sense, end quote, within the Lebenswelt in which we already live, thus providing the basis for all the epistemological experiences in which we assert ourselves, logically judging and discerning through communication, learning, and tradition. In contrast, the problem for Marxist theory consists in the social derivation of this pre-given horizon of experience, in the determination of the self-generated process of production. Today, the subject of these synthetic achievements can neither be a transcendental subject nor a self-constituted subject of the human species, which determines the structure of objects and relations which express the subjective moment of objectification created through labor, as well as the moment of material objectification of appropriated nature, is the fundamental contradiction between their quality as use value and as exchange value. For Lukács, this contradiction emerging in the subject of individual proletarians, through which they are simultaneously subject and object, is speaking, self-activating, and at the same time activated commodities, and object of the market-mediated value relation. In this model of subject-object dialectic, the identity of subject and object in the proletariat is brought together as a class, and as the lever of the becoming of consciousness, which is consciousness of its social position, and thus of the social totality. In other words, as a commodity, the proletariat is the object of exploitation, while at the same time, the proletariat is the producer of social wealth and the subject of a new society. One second. Whenever Korsch speaks of constitution in this context, it is a matter of the process of self-constitution of the proletariat as a self-sufficient and unified class. However, the forms in which the working class, self-understood as a productive force, modified, co-constituted, and yet remain dependent upon the empirical reality, his real abstraction of value and form of appearance, technical rationality, formal law, and bureaucracy, were determined by commodity production. These forms are not questioned by Korsch on the level of historical and materialist investigations. Yet for one of the crucial problems of Korsch's theory, i.e. the social causes and the critique of reformism, it is important to establish the degree to which the objective world surrounding the proletarian expresses the estrangement of bourgeois commodity production, or is the visible result of proletarian action, indeterminate institutions, relations, or legal regulations, so that it is not merely self-deception for the individual proletarian when he identifies with them. In fact, today the constitution of social objects and the objectivity of experience is determined by a contradictory process rooted in two classes. As far as the achievement of constitution by the bourgeois class is concerned, the individual proletarians are subordinated to the heterogeneous laws of the capitalist form of production and exchange in their ideas, needs, and language. Indeed, even in their spontaneity, individual proletarians' perception and thinking is still bound with the naturalistic framework of an antagonistic commodity-producing market society to capitalist immediacy. On the other hand, there are constitutive efforts of the proletarian class, a unifying organization which, as the collective worker, Gesamtarbeiter, anticipates the coming society. As a collective subject, it already so structures the objective world under generalized conditions of capitalism that it no longer appears to individual proletarians as totally strange, but is penetrated by elements which belong to the individual proletarians and are products of organized struggle. These contradictorily constituted institutions, e.g. labor courts, plans of codetermination, etc., allow greater possibilities for identification with the existing system, but also create the need for a more complete appropriation of the objective world, e.g. factory occupations, changing production, etc. Korsch illustrated these relations in a series of historical examples. In Korsch's theory, however, the mechanism of bourgeois commodity production remains static. In production and in the organization of the productive forces, the organic composition of capital changes so little that the sensual practical activity, that active conduct of men toward nature in the industrial labor process, as expressed in the first thesis on Feuerbach, almost completely loses its material substantive side, which structures the proletariat's behavior and consciousness. Since Korsch separates the first two levels of the constitution of social reality, namely production and class struggle, the specific forms in which individual classes change reality also drop out of view. Thus, wholly against his intention, Korsch's theory takes on the character of reflection theory. Lenin had already indicated that, as epistemological criterion of objective truth and objective knowledge, praxis also encompasses such things as astronomical observations, discoveries, etc. Thus, class struggle is only one form of object constitution, but not yet the predominant one within bourgeois commodity production. Even in advanced class struggles, these struggles still exist under conditions where objects are the reified result of the capitalist mode of production and of bourgeois class domination. In specific modes of production, institutional objective forms constitute the material presuppositions from which every promising class struggle must start, even if its content consists precisely in their overcoming. Korsch's determinations of the relation of theory and empiricism, of consciousness and being, move within the already constituted. Thus, at least in this question, they have lost that reflexive standpoint which had already been reached not only by Marx and Engels, but also by Kantian philosophy. There are systematic reasons for this. They mainly relate to the Korschian concept of experience. In the third volume of Capital, Marx had used the term of social construction, gesellschaftliche Konstruktion, in order to describe the secret deception at the basis of the constitution of the objective reality of experience. Quote, the specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of direct producers determines the relationship of rulers and ruled as it grows directly out of production itself, and in turn reacts upon it as a determining element. Upon this, however, is founded the entire formation of the economic community, which grows up out of the production relations themselves, thereby simultaneously its specific political form. It is always the direct relationship of the owners of the conditions of production to the direct producers, a relation always naturally corresponding to a defining stage in the development of the methods of labor, and thereby its social productivity, which reveals the innermost secret, the hidden basis of the entire social structure. Parenthesis, der ganzen gesellschaftlichen Konstruktion, and with it the political form of the relation of sovereignty and dependence. In short, the corresponding specific form of the state. This does not prevent the same economic basis, the same from the standpoint of its main conditions, due to innumerable different empirical circumstances, natural, environmental, racial tensions, external historical influences, etc., from showing infinite variations and gradations in appearance, which can be ascertained only by analysis of the empirically given circumstances. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 3. 1 second. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry. Wanted to copy that down. Viewed from the side of the knowing and experiencing subject, this, quote, innermost secret, mediated by production, refers to that process of total social constitution which Marx emphasized in the theses on Feuerbach, in opposing the active side of German idealism to intuitive materialism, parenthesis, Anschauendes Materialismus, end parenthesis. The chief deficiency of all previous materialism, parenthesis, the Feuerbachian variety included, end parenthesis, is that the object reality sensuous is only apprehended in the form of objects or perception, parenthesis, Anschauung, end parenthesis, and not as sensuous human activity, praxis, not subjectively. To the extent that Korsch does not understand praxis as the concrete totality of production, as the object constituting processes of struggling classes and of material production processes, Korsch's theory splits into three parts which receive different emphasis alongside each other in his work. Elements of intuitive materialism are evident in the individual empirical analytical sciences, which basically deal with the, quote, empirically given circumstances, end quote, and the, quote, infinite variations and gradations of appearance, end quote. The science of the capitalist mode of production is analyzed once and for all in the Marxian critique of political economy and can only be repeated in individual cases. On the other hand, where Marxian theory is confirmed as an active historical theory, is a theory of class struggle. On the other hand, where Marxian theory is confirmed as an active historical theory, it is a theory of class struggle. If over a long period this struggle threatens to lose its visibility, as during the period of prosperity of post-war capitalism, then such a restrictively defined theory loses its real object of knowledge and its justification for existence. Korsch finally drew this conclusion. As Korsch has clearly recognized, the concept of experience must be at the center of every materialistic science. The concept of experience must be at the center of every materialistic science. For science is nothing but a specific mode of methodically organizing experience. In principle, there are no similarities between the bourgeois and the proletarian organization of experience, because the life situations from which they originate and to which they refer are fundamentally different. Only when compared on the level of abstract methodological research, formal logic, technical instruments, operationalization of claims, etc., do they reveal common aspects. Of course, within ideology, the instruments of knowledge arising within the bourgeois division of labor, the professionalization of scientific social thought, and technical rationalization define the exclusive frame of reference within which binding knowledge is considered possible. Materialist science does not differ from bourgeois science by limiting the horizon of reflection to the proletarian class standpoint or by rejecting available instruments of knowledge. Rather, materialist science differs in its particular conception of truth. Materialist science aims at the historical verification and transformation of what hinders the scientist and the masses from producing practical knowledge and self-experiences without restraints. It cannot dispense with the practical emancipatory control and feedback of its findings. Materialist science is rooted in a determinate mode of production and is in its form and content drawn towards the proletarian life situation where the experiences of the masses are organized in particular ways. The mediations in the experiential continuum between the proletarian science and class struggle are entirely lacking in Korsch's theory. There is no mention of the thing-like and reified forms of appearance of the essence of capitalist production, which proletarians can experience individually, and in isolation is that multiplicity of empirical circumstances and, quote, gradations of appearance, end quote, mentioned by Marx. Afraid of falling into the error of vulgar economics, which, quote, insists on the semblance against the law of appearance, end quote, the appearances of the capitalist commodity world determining proletarian consciousness and behavior become completely meaningless for Korsch. To be sure, in an unpublished article written in 1932 on the, quote, dialectic des Alltags, the dialectic of the everyday, Korsch anticipated the phenomenological mode of observation, which later also gained ground within Marxist philosophical discussions of the social Lebenswelt, life world. But this analysis was more specifically meant to show the vitality of dialectical thought in everyday experience than with elaborating the constitutive context of theory and empirical research. But Korsch's theory touches yet another problem. What is, quote, objective truth, as contraposed to simple empirical confirmation? One of the passages most frequently cited by Korsch is from the Communist Manifesto. Theory is, quote, merely an expression of the real historical movement going on under our very eyes, end quote. Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto. Footnote. Literally, the Communist Manifesto reads, quote, the theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. They merely express in general terms actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement growing on under our very eyes. End quote. Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto. End footnote. Where the hell am I? Come on. Okay. Since here theory must be directed toward the concrete totality of society, this conception has nothing to do with the traditional definition of truth. Adequatio intellectus atquari, the agreement of the conception of the judgment with the things examined. Rather, it has more to do with the Hegelian point that an untrue state is a bad state to be historically overcome. Theory describing objective truth provides not only an adequate means for the description of the given social reality, but also contains an anticipatory structure. An anticipatory structure, a permanent reaching forward to the true, i.e., revolutionary transforming praxis. This conception of objective truth is confirmed in the reality it produces, in a changing of the conditions constituting the given. It cannot therefore be conclusively refuted by empirical relations. Even if these essentially determine the force giving life to revolutionary theory as well as praxis. Marx means nothing else when Marx attacks praxisless theory in the second thesis on Feuerbach. Quote, the question whether human thinking can arrive at objective truth is not a theoretical question but a practical question. Man has to prove the truth, that is, the reality and power, the this-sidedness of his thinking in praxis. End quote. Marx. The corpus of Korsch's work by no means has a transparent unitary structure, but there are lines of development which provide continuity. Korsch is practical in his increasing isolation from the real class struggles. But theoretically, and that may sound paradoxical, Korsch is broken with Marxian orthodoxy. As no other Marxist theoretician has done, Korsch has tried again and again, with intellectual integrity and determination, to interpret and empirically substantiate every Marxian thesis in the actual events of class struggle. Nevertheless, Korsch regards Marxist theory as a monumental philosophy of transcendence, whose major categories need to be better grounded but not changed. This position was helped by him long before he explicitly formulated it in Karl Marx, the book. Quote, in Capital, the typical form of critique is, quote, transcendental, end quote. End quote. Korsch. Footnote. See the German edition of Karl Marx by Karl Korsch. End footnote. Quote, in this kind of critique, the fundamental economic analysis is not eliminated, but its historically specific limitations are rejected. As a social, historical, practical critique of political economy, Marxist theory remains an economic theory, which is not transformed into a direct historical and social science and praxis, end quote. Korsch. Karl Marx. To be sure, Korsch clearly recognized the historical limitations of a Marxist theory, reduced to the Marxist theory's economic form, but until its final break with, quote, Marxism's monopolistic claims, end quote, there is near theoretical perspective transcending it. at most perhaps a practical one. In this way, Korsch himself blocks the way which could lead to an active further development in Marxist theory. Since Korsch was such a fanatic for historical specificity, it is surprising that Korsch did not write any theoretically determined material analysis on specific social phenomena. Korsch's discussions concerning the union wages, the Dawes Plan, the Spanish collectives, fascism, the Soviet Union, etc., are not stamped with that analytical strength displayed in his work concerning other theories. There exists a world historical actuality for revolution, but the revolution is not on the agenda for advanced industrial capitalist countries. This contradiction needs to be grasped theoretically and brought to its practical organizational consequences. The revolutionary left has just begun to update a practical theoretical elaboration of the theory of the workers' movement, which has as its political meaning the development of revolutionary perspectives under the special conditions of existence found in highly industrialized capitalist countries. For this part, the updating and appropriation of Korsch's thought is an indispensable step. Korsch's theory, which seismographically records a half-century of contradictions, catastrophes, defeats, and triumphs of the proletarian emancipatory movement, resists any affirmative use oriented around institutional needs. In its substantial content as practical knowledge, Korsch's theory is a critical revolutionary theory in decisive opposition to Marxism as a science of legitimation. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.